Chapter 7. Me and Bonnie Blair, Shani Davis, Racial Myths, and the Reiteration of the Facts of Blackness. By C. Richard King. In early 2006, Disney released Glory Road, a retelling of the triumph of Texas Western over the University of Kentucky in 1966 to win the National Collegiate Athletic Association Men's Basketball Championship. 40 years later, it relished the powerful underdog story, the victory of an all-black team over a segregated and storied program from the undead Jim Crow South. In common with other recent sport films, it offered a nostalgic, even celebratory, reworking of a real event, intent to remind audiences of deeper truths. Although panned by critics, Glory Road underscored social change through sport, reiterating familiar, if not cliched, myths about the end of racism, breaking the color line, and palpable progress in race relations. The opening of the 2006 Winter Olympics, featuring the most diverse U.S. team ever, seemed poised to allow Americans to affirm their commitments to inclusion and equality. The Games, however, would expose the hollowness of dominant racial ideologies while reinforcing the dehumanizing force of racism. Indeed, African-American speed skater Shani Davis simultaneously afforded an occasion to rehearse racial myths and to restate the facts of blackness. Over the past decade, he has emerged as a world-class athlete, displaying a unique combination of prowess, dedication, and character. Unlike many of his peers who specialize in either short track or long track, Davis enjoys and excels at both events. A member of the U.S. Winter Olympic team, he opts to train away from his teammates in Calgary, Canada, and to be sponsored by a Dutch corporation. An African American, he has risen to the top in a field dominated by Europeans and Euro-Americans. And despite his working-class background, Davis has thrived in a vocation demanding access to cultural capital, material wealth, and leisure time. Finally, as commentators almost universally delight in recounting, as a youth when his peers in Chicago adored basketball great Michael Jordan, eagerly consuming merchandise bearing his name and likeness, Davis idolized speed skater Bonnie Blair and proudly wore a t-shirt celebrating her around his neighborhood. For all of this, however, Davis is, to borrow a colloquialism, the exception that proves the rule. In fact, the interpretive frames used to make sense of the speed skater reinforce dominant preconceptions and preoccupations about race, class, and gender, revealing the current shape and ongoing significance of racialization in American sport and society. They expose the processes and practices at the heart of what has been dubbed alternately new racism, colorblind racism, or cultural racism, on the one hand, deracialization, or efforts or intent to erase race while disavowing racism, and, on the other hand, the seemingly inevitable return and reiteration of racialization in more subtle and powerful forms. Significantly, as I argue in what follows, it is precisely those features that make Davis exceptional that have facilitated efforts to deny and reproduce the differences that racial difference makes. My analysis affirms and extends the increasingly sophisticated study of black athletes, which has aptly demonstrated the ways in which their bodies and behaviors demarcate key cultural boundaries, mediating moral dramas and power plays, while facilitating the application and amplification of sincere fictions intent to restabilize racial hierarchies. My intent here is not to retell Shani Davis's life story. Instead, I undertake a critical reading of competing accounts of the athlete, his achievements, and his identity to clarify the underlying articulations of ideology, power, and difference that anchor them. My approach builds on the insights of Stuart Hall and others working in cultural studies whose critical engagements with sporting, and other social, worlds conceive of representations of difference as signifying practices that reflect, extend, and, under the right circumstances, challenge racial hierarchies. Such an approach probes the ways in which representations of difference produce meaning in context. The circulation and consumption of racial representations, then, as the analysis that follows underscores, actively constitute racial meaning in the broader racialized social order. My undertaking, moreover, resonates with the critical sport studies outlined by Susan Burrell and Mary G. McDonald, who advocate reading sport. Reading sporting compels us to read in a different, more theoretically charged manner. The methodology of reading sport, that is, of finding the cultural meanings that circulate within narratives of particular incidents or celebrities, also requires attention to the ways that sexuality, race, gender, and class privileges are articulated in those accounts. Thus, while the organization and enactment of mundane sporting worlds offer rich insights, cultural crises and public panics provide the most fertile social fields for critical analysis. As a consequence, my interpretation of Davis concerns itself primarily with the production and reception of the 2006 Winter Olympics in Torino, Italy. Specifically, I probed the stagings of Davis by himself and others in advance of the competition, highlighting the manner in which they emphasize racelessness, individualism, and mobility. Then, I unpacked the new racism animating the outrage expressed over Davis's decision not to participate in the team pursuit event and its impact on Euro-American skater Chad Hedrick's quest to win 5 gold medals. Throughout, I argue that while Davis, in echoing many of the themes central to deracialization in post-civil rights America, should have been primed for cultural embrace and commercial success not unlike that enjoyed by Michael Jordan and for a time O.J. Simpson, the very logic grounding his acceptability ultimately re-racialized him, affirming the centrality of sport in current efforts to restate the facts of blackness. NEW, racism. Racism must not be confused with prejudice, it instead must be understood as domination. It is not simply that whites lack knowledge or have bad attitudes. Racism refers to a system of social relations, a set of structural inequalities, cultural forms, and ideological norms, all rooted in racialized conceptions and categories. Moreover, rather than an aberrant, extreme, or antiquated feature of the American experience, racism must be understood as normal, everyday, and ever-present, defining American institutions and ideologies. And like race, Hall reminds us, racism must be grounded, understood as constructed and conditional. Racism is always historically specific. Though it may draw on the traces deposited by previous historical phases, it always takes on specific forms. It arises out of the present, not past, conditions. Its effects are specific to the present organization of society, to the present unfolding of its dynamic political and cultural processes, not simply to its repressed past. Racism is both ideological and institutional, involving much more than individual intention, ideas, or attitudes. For all of this, racism has become increasingly slippery. In the absence of overt markers, racism is often difficult to both define and locate within contemporary discussions. Despite the unwillingness or inability of commentators, pundits, politicians, journalists, and everyday citizens to come to terms with the persistent presence of race and racism, scholars have crafted critical frameworks, noteworthy for the sophistication they bring to bear upon the reconfigurations of racism in post-civil rights America. Patricia Hill Collins and others have referred to this reconfigured racial formation as new racism. Structured by emergent global economic flows and transnational webs of power, mass media and spectacle play an increasingly important role in the manufacture of consent. They present hegemonic ideologies that claim that racism is over. They work to obscure the racism that does exist and they undercut anti-racist protest. 3 novel features, according to Amy Ansell, have proven crucial to the solidification of this social formation and its capacity to reproduce racial hierarchy in this context. 1. A sanitized, coded language about race that adheres to, more than it departs from, generally accepted liberal principles and values, mobilized for a liberal ends. 2. Avid disavowals of racist intent and circumvention of classical anti-racist discourse. And 3. A shift from a focus on race and biological relations to a concern for cultural differentiation and national identity. Notwithstanding the vast statistical data illustrating racial inequality, the established common sense of new racism allows individuals and institutions to explain away the apparent contradiction between professed color blindness and the United States color-coded inequality. Embracing a variety of lenses and rhetorical strategies, whites are able to rework America's contemporary racial reality to legitimize notions of fairness, freedom, opportunity, equality, democracy, and America. The increasing visibility of people of color in the media, popular culture, and sport has proven fundamental to efforts to advance new racist formulations of racial progress. Eduardo Bonilla Silva conceives of colorblindness as a primary building block of the racial ideologies that supports and extends the reigning racialized order of things. Like all ideologies, he continues, colorblindness works because it offers a set of frames to account for and make sense of race and racism. Specifically, he suggests that within the context of new racism whites employ 4 frames: 1. Abstract liberalism, an ethos blending individualism, a rhetoric of equality, and choice. 2. Naturalization, or the assertion that racial phenomena are natural occurrences. 3. Cultural racism, the appeal to culture to explain difference, and 4. Minimization, or efforts to reduce or dismiss the continuing significance of race and racism. Importantly, then, color blindness blinds Americans to the realities of white supremacy as both an historical force and a social condition. White supremacy is best understood as a set of ideological and institutional arrangements that has structured U.S. society past and present, endowing Euro-Americans with privileges and advantages on the basis of their skin color. Whereas white supremacy formerly demanded self-conscious schemes and explicit hierarchies, such as eugenics and scientific racism, as well as unapologetic restrictions and legal prohibitions on citizenship, immigration, and race mixing, for instance, today the defense of white power hinges on denial and deflection that locate racism in the past or within fringe or extremist movements, including the white nationalists discussed herein, while recoding racial rhetoric in the languages of diversity, cultural difference, and the key words of the mainstream civil rights movement, reverse racism, for instance. In what follows, I want to map out the complexities of new racism, highlighting accepted features and unanticipated elements. That is, whereas the coverage of Davis clearly frames him in terms that simultaneously erase and reinscribe racism, abstract liberalism, cultural racism, code words, and minimization, of equal importance, and contra Bonilla Silva, Davis himself embraces the frames of color blindness, while audiences strive to expose the facts of blackness. Sporting rationality and racelessness. Sporting discourses encourage racelessness. The rationalization of competition, including uniform rules, precise timekeeping, standardized fields of play, and record-keeping, pivot around abstraction, universalism, and comparability. They build an archive of incontrovertible accomplishments, quantifiable facts, ripped from context, discourage critical reflection. These building blocks of sporting narrative, importantly, allow no room for race, power, or circumstance. Gatekeepers and fans alike transform these tidbits into talismans, fetishes embodying the significance of events and individuals. Repeatedly, accounts of Davis dwell on these details, but many offer little more than a catalog of feats and facts. To offer but one example from a fan site. Name: Shani Davis. Birthdate: August 13, 1982. Hometown: Chicago, Illinois. Current residence: Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Olympic sport: speed skating. Medals: gold, men's 1000 meter, 2006, 2010. Silver, men's 1500 meter, 2006, 2010. World All-Around Champion, 2005. Set the world record in the men's 1500 meter long track, 2005. U.S. All-Around Champion, 2003, 2004 and 2005. Bronze medalist, World Short Track Relay Team, 2005. 1500 meter World Champion, 2004. First overall U.S. Junior Speed Skating Championships, Long Track, 2001. Second overall U.S. Junior Speed Skating Championships, Long Track, 2000. Short Track Junior American Record 1000 meter, 2002. Only a beginning to be sure, these fragments limit narrative possibilities. Playing fields become more important than social fields as athletics and accomplishments eclipse ideology and discourage engagement. Such erasures and silences, in turn, make it easier for fans, players, commentators, and gatekeepers to forget about, turn away from, and work against racialization and its effects. The Michael Jordan of skating. Although Davis purportedly idolized Bonnie Blair as a youth, he has come to see his role in the skating world as more akin to her contemporary, basketball great Michael Jordan. In fact, he repeatedly has told reporters that he would like to be like Mike, or at least regarded as the Michael Jordan of skating. For Davis, like Jordan, this has meant more than being a great athlete, receiving the admiration of kids, or even cultivating an affirmative and approachable air. Most basically, it has demanded that he endeavor to transcend race. In pursuit of racelessness, Davis has repeatedly denounced the import of race, echoing the sincere fiction structuring post-civil rights America. When asked about making the U.S. Olympic speed skating team in 2002, the first African American to accomplish this feat, Davis replied, "It means something, it does not matter what color I am. Black or white, Asian or Hispanic, it does not matter to me as long as the message that I am portraying to the people that watch me on television is positive. And it shows them that they can do things that are different besides tossing a football, hitting a bat at a baseball or shooting a basketball. I am just showing them that stepping outside of that bubble is okay." Here, Davis slides between a trivialization of race that affirms the principles of color blindness and a seeming invocation of difference that marks his audience as like him, black, limited by boundaries and conventional associations between African Americans and specific sports. When asked a similar question before the 2006 Winter Olympics, he once more minimized race, preferring the frames of individualism and abstract liberalism. Allen, San Diego, how does it feel to be the first African American skater to qualify for the Olympics? Davis, I don't think it feels any different than any other person who qualified for the Olympics. I'm just happy to be here and have a good shot at chasing my childhood and teenage dreams. In fact, in advance of the games, he routinely deflected all lines of questioning that involved the importance of his being a black champion, preferring instead for the public to celebrate his victory, regardless of his color. Or, as he told another reporter, regardless of color, I want to be the best I can be. On the eve of his victory in the 1,000 meters, moreover, Davis minimized the importance of his achievements as a black athlete. It's a breakthrough, but it's what people make of it. Obviously, breaking the color line and accomplishing an African American first were irrelevant, matters of interpretation, rather than markers of progress. Ultimately, prior to the games, Davis believed race to be an individual concern and of much less consequence than personal desire and achievement. As he told one interviewer, I try not to make much of it. Being black is the choice of the parents who made me. It has no effect on my skating. I go out there like every other skater and want to win. 3 months after the Olympics, Davis still had an ambivalent relationship with his blackness. Q. Do you feel like you were representing all African Americans at the Olympics? A. Just in general, I skate in whoever they want to associate my accomplishments with, I have no control over it. But I think the way things were swung was that I was going to bat for the African Americans out there, and I have no problem with it. Note, his detachment here, his unwillingness to associate himself, his pronounced desire to put race off. Bootstraps. Davis not only endorsed a familiar colorblind logic intent to deny the significance of race, but he also proclaimed the importance of individual effort to success and mobility. In presentations to young people as well as interviews, the speed skater reiterates the same themes. If you put your mind to it and you believe, you can achieve it. You cannot give up, even if the road is a tough road. Or, it showed that all the hard work and all the sacrifice paid off. Kids in general, if you put your mind to it and you believe it, you can achieve it. Importantly, Davis does not specify the barriers, obstacles, and challenges. Neither race nor class enters into his rhetoric. They do not matter. Instead, it is persistence, commitment, sacrifice, faith, and effort by abstract individuals that counts. Indeed, although teased as child, Davis persisted, pursuing his personal dreams. I always went against the grade. I didn't care what people said. That's skin deep. I did what I like. Not surprisingly, reporters and commentators echoed the bootstrap frame employed by Davis, repeating almost ad nauseum his mobility despite the odds and obstacles because of his hard work and the sacrifice made by his mother. Similarly, many of his supporters share Davis's common interpretation. Jesse Chavez, a fan from Chicago, found in Davis a motivational narrative, one in which Contra Davis marked race briefly, only to hold it under erasure. He's the first African American to win an individual gold, and that's great, but especially since he is from the South Side, his story is kind of an inspiration for all the kids who want to do anything. He shows us no matter where you are from or what your background is, you can succeed if you put your mind to it. Forget about race, identity, not power, matters, the individual rather than society makes a difference. Life's not fair. In many respects, Davis's raceless rhetoric runs counter to his own experience, complicating his self-presentation as well as public perceptions of him. If space provided, an entire catalog of dismissive attitudes and disparaging comments that have long shadowed his presence in speed skating and which culminated at the 2006 Winter Olympics might be recorded here. 2 earlier reiterations of race/racism in a seemingly raceless world warrant brief mention. In the summer of 1996, while training at the Olympic Village in Lake Placid, New York, Davis joined an impromptu basketball game against his roommate, Dave Needham. In the course of the ensuing game, Needham called Davis boy some 35 times, by Davis's count. Enraged at the conclusion of the game, Davis hurled the ball at his roommate, injuring the latter's leg. Both skaters were suspended, but notably Davis received a harsher penalty. Nearly 5 years later, in his native Chicago, Davis was stopped and searched by 2 white, plainclothes police officers as he walked down the street one evening. At the time, Davis remarked, "I felt powerless due to the fact he, the officer, had a weapon and I felt my life could be at stake at any moment. I felt like a criminal. I mean, he made me feel like dirt." The speed skater joined a class action lawsuit against the city that has yet to be settled. The commonness of racial profiling in Chicago led one commentator to suggest that for future protection Davis should wear his Olympic gold medal around his neck. A few months earlier, not even his gold medal could protect him from a racist backlash. Restating the facts of blackness. While Shani Davis deferred race regularly in interviews and press conferences, embodied experiences, with the police and teammates, for instance, repeatedly restated the facts of blackness. And, in contrast with the racelessness projected by the media, organizers, and much of the public, the 2006 Olympic Games in Torino, Italy, would not witness popular embrace of the African American speed skater as anything other than a black athlete, outside and against white America. The trouble for Davis began with a media spectacle that constructed Davis and longtime rival Chad Hedrick in diametrically opposed terms: urban, black youth marginalized by his sport and succeeding against the odds versus the all-American boy from Texas poised to win 5 gold medals, and escalated when Davis refused to participate in the team pursuit event, endangering Hedrick's quest. In the subsequent media storm, the former inline skater from Texas became a valorized victim and team player wronged by an immature, selfish, and arrogant punk, whose every action, from interview style to sponsorship, became suspect. Although most commentators would deny race or racism informed their positions, the subsequent reaction against Davis pivoted around his blackness, albeit through code words and superficially deracialized sentiments. In the post-civil rights era, where the content of one's character, not the color of one's skin, has become the mantra of the neoconservative backlash, it is not surprising that character would become a central concern. Many observers saw in Davis a maladjusted person, exhibiting irrational tendencies and unwarranted emotions. Bill, for instance, found him to be a selfish angry man regardless of the color of his skin, and claimed, "It is obvious that Davis has serious mental issues." Assessment of demeanor, behavior, and expressions, particularly anger, remain powerful ways to problematize difference and racialize without race. Others went further, preferring to infantilize Davis. "He is not a mature man, but a little boy." Worse were comments that policed the invocation of race, suggesting that not only was his character flawed, in common with poor white trash, but also that by being unable to admit this, he is a black man, unlike model minorities, had to play the race card. "Shani has a chip on his shoulder and behaved deplorably, end of story. Make excuses for him if you like, call Hedrick a trashy cracker if you must, but Davis is a brat whose attitude has spoiled something that is supposed to be pure. Even if there is drama, why can't he rise above it and represent USA for something we want to be seen as? You don't see Ono with a sourpuss face, or Quan pulling the race card." And the echoes of previous racial formations reverberate powerfully in the present: a brat, a spoiler, a bad actor, a malcontent, an impure and unruly presence, a weak black man unable to cope and thus must make excuses. Explanations of Davis's flawed character ranged widely but most often settled on his upbringing. To many commentators, the speed skater was the byproduct of the ghetto, a gangster out of place, unrefined, and ill-mannered. "You are at the Olympics, world stage," 1000M noted, "not the streets of Chicago, Davis. Get a freaking clue." Lease added, "He gave a stunning display of his gang mentality." And Kra charged, "Shani ain't nothing but a piece of shit punk and I hope he breaks his leg." In these comments, streets of Chicago, gang mentality, and punk, all code blackness and describe it as deviant, criminal, and problematic. Together, his failed character and its purported origins led many commentators to question his commitments to team and nation. Indeed, Davis exemplified the black athlete. He was a typical arrogant, pampered, and self-centered athlete, or worse, Shani Davis has abundantly shown that he's no Jackie Robinson. Far from the role model and hero who changed race relations and has become the mythic icon embodying integration and the end of race, Davis is a self-absorbed athlete looking out for himself, not society or teammates. As Julie the Jarhead put it, "There is no I in team, but there is in Shani." Hunter went further, once more erasing race, even as he reiterated racist sentiments: "I don't care if he is white, black, pink, or blue. Color has nothing to do with my disgust, sick, of this so-called man. He is on Team USA. Team, that means you work as a team and do whatever you can for the team and the country USA, not Canada." I have never seen a more selfish act than what this young man has done. He has had the chance to stand up and be a Tiger Woods, Magic, Ali, or Jordan, but no, he had to be Team Davis. It's all about him. Although not about color, Davis clearly is not fully human, nor does he possess the qualities of other athletes who have more successfully transcended race. His failure to put the interest of a white skater before his own and to stay in place and remain subservient and loyal compelled many to denounce Davis. Whereas some observers employ gender as a blunt weapon, maybe there's room for him on the women's curling team. Others prefer to associate him with animals through scatological references. I hope the only box he gets his face plastered on is a box of kitty litter. More common, however, were interrogations of his Americanness, affirming that blackness still results in disenfranchisement. Look, this isn't about race. It's about a very lonely speed skater. A Canadian speed skater wearing a U.S. outfit. Not adorned with the U.S. sponsorship worn by every last one of his teammates, but that of a Dutch corporation. He may have been born in Chicago, but he lives in Canada, all the while very visibly snubbing his teammates. Anybody who values the patriotic aspects of these Olympic Games. Claims to citizenship, inclusion and equality, continue to hinge on race, despite the sentiments of this commentator, who does not question Hedrick's commitments or self-interest but instead targets Davis. In the end, the angry mob that set upon Davis for not staying in his place gave voice in more comfortable terms to the comments of one anonymous online commentator. Can't you fucking people get over it? It's the Olympics. We're not into hood. We're in front of the world, and this moron decides to act. Not like an American. But like a nigger. It's actually funny to watch you people in your simian antics, dancing around the end zone after scoring a touchdown, flunking SATs, filling the jails, and generally just acting like the total losers you are. This is just another example of that. The black ape man who doesn't understand sportsmanship. Just proves the basic principle, you can take the nigger out of the hood, but you can't take the hood out of the nigger. More than a half-century after Frantz Fanon assessed the fact of blackness, encoded in obvious ways, in a friendly and hateful manner, in an intentional and artifactual fashion, Euro-Americans repeat, the Negro is an animal, the Negro is bad, the Negro is mean, the Negro is ugly, look a nigger. For many, in February 2006, Shani Davis became not the first African American to win a gold medal in an individual event at the Winter Olympics or a great athlete worthy of celebration. No, he became a nigger. Critical possibilities. Although not given voice in mainstream venues, the spectacle surrounding the speed skater fostered critical reflections on race and sport, revealing the limits of common-sense understandings of race and racism. While many of the marginalized counter-readings celebrated Davis's accomplishments, criticized Hedrick, or challenged the media coverage, an important feature of a number of commentaries was the correlation between race and power, particularly white privilege. For instance, the blog Yellow Content noted, what is the deal with white people thinking that a person of color is bad simply because they don't do what people want them to do? Sure, it's fun when people listen to you, or you agree with them, but isn't disagreement a normal state of human existence? When folks in an ethnic majority question ethnic minorities more for not doing what they are told, we can see an ugly underbelly of ethnic privilege. Basically, they don't like the fact that they don't have control over the people of color. Hedrick and 5 medals is not going to improve the quality of my life. Shani Davis's accomplishments just might in some minor, yet significant way. Similarly, Terrence remarked on his blog, sometimes the overtones of white privilege are overt, which I believe is the case in this situation. Other times it is unconscious behavior. This attitude of white entitlement happens in many facets of life, business, education, sports, entertainment, etc. Surely, there are a lot of white people who do not feel or act this way, but many do feel and act as such. And finally, Shani Davis got it right. We're off the plantation now. He's not some white athlete's manservant. These comments share in a recognition of the force and effects of racial power while hinting at instability. Davis refuses to stay in his place or acquiesce, and as consequence unsettles an established set of expectations, which pundits, journalists, teammates, and fans endeavor to fix through their application of racial common sense that demonizes, pathologizes, and dehumanizes Davis. This same common sense and the racialized social order it anchors, moreover, makes critical analyses like these inaudible to most Americans, either marginalized and hence underheard or incomprehensible and thus refuted. Media makeover? In advance of the 2010 Winter Olympics, the Calgary Herald noted that Shani Davis had undergone a transformation. Indeed, the profile expresses surprise that, in contrast with his reputation, Davis was witty, warm and accommodating. A change that caused the author to wonder if this was a calculated public relations makeover or the emergence of the real Shani Davis. Michelle Iskausen went so far as to suggest a kinder, gentler Davis came to Vancouver in 2010. Perhaps because of his accessibility to sport journalists hungry for celebrity storylines, his success at the 2010 Games, where he won a gold medal, repeating in the 1,000 meters and a silver medal in the 1,500 meters, or his reconciliation with teammates, it was the media itself that appeared, at least in tone, to have given Davis the makeover. In the absence of a conflict with his white teammate, Chad Hedrick, he was given his due as a superstar, unrecognized, even neglected, by most Americans. Rather than a villain, intent to harm the team and the nation, sport journalists painted a more human portrait of a more likable athlete. Oddly, they achieved this largely by highlighting his love of other cultures and nations, specifically Japan and the Netherlands, and the status, integration, and celebrity he had achieved there. While still positioned outside, beyond the pale as it were, some commentators sought to refute previous framings, affirming his Americanness. For instance, columnist Kevin Blackistone suggested that Davis must be embraced as fully American. Davis is an American ideal, the self-made man. As in the past, his achievements, hard work, and dedication at once stabilize a mythic meritocracy and prove a claim to citizenship that should have never been in question, and would not have been had Davis been white. Indeed, as Blackistone highlights, even at the 2010 Games the media took issue with Davis's individualism and the distance he continued to put between himself and the U.S. speed skating establishment, while letting white athletes like Shaun White and Bode Miller off the hook by not remarking on them. Despite the makeover, then, even as they represented Davis to the American public, the sport media employed a white racial frame that rested upon and reiterated the same double standards. The facts of blackness were restated in more overt ways as well. While numerous participants in online discussions of Davis praised his achievements in Vancouver and laid claim to them as especially noteworthy for blacks, almost invariably comments would be posted questioning his character and Americanness, reminding others of his purported transgressions in 2006 and condemning, primarily, African Americans for introducing race into the conversation. Such devolutions hold little surprise to anyone who has read, even casually, online discussions that touch upon questions of race and identity. More elaborate postings also recycled the dominant frames from Churino. Mary, on her blog Eden Freedom, lamented Davis's behavior after winning his gold medal, wondering what distracted him from the flag and carried him deep into thought during the medal ceremony. In addition to the return of past tropes, new white fears were given voice. With an image of Shani Davis skating in Vancouver behind him and under the heading Jerry Curling, an obvious play on a hair care product aimed at African Americans and a traditional winter sport, comedian and television host Bill Maher sought to express it through humor during the New Rules segment of his weekly show, New Rule: No Black Athletes in the Winter Olympics. There's a reason we schedule these things in the cold and snow, so the tropical people won't show up and kick our ass. Look, you've got football, basketball, and the presidency. Is it too much to leave us the ice dancing? Here, Maher uses a joke to reiterate fictions his audience believes to be true. Whiteness is imperiled. Mainstream society and institutions formerly dominated by whites have been overrun by non-whites, tropical peoples, who are physically superior and by implication culturally inferior. A mongrel creation threatens to prevail, one adorned with black hair and urban style in an unexpected and by design unwelcome place. And here, Marco's sport journalists and countless Americans who through Shani Davis restate the facts of blackness as they produce and consume sincere fictions about race, sport, and society. Conclusion. Perhaps his much-maligned mother Cherie best captures the themes of this chapter as well as the prominence of racism in speed skating. In her response to a question about her advice to other African Americans who might consider the sport, she quipped, "I tell them to run track." What she misses here is that the problem cannot be outrun, precisely because it is not limited to white-dominated sports. To speak metaphorically, speed skating in its long track variation requires participants to cross over, alternating between the inside and outside lanes. Like skaters, Davis, and other, black athletes who cross over always already return. Their blackness overdetermines their production and reception in post-civil rights America. New racism has restructured common-sense understandings of race, reworking of racial myths in more comfortable and comforting terms, which effectively restabilize racial hierarchies while letting those with power off the hook. Moreover, Davis illustrates the important, if understudied, ways in which African American athletes internalize and employ the vocabularies of new racism. In fact, if nothing else, Shani Davis's brief career highlights what I would argue should be one of the key questions for future work on race and sport, namely how and why black athletes embrace the frames of colorblind racism, even when they know the facts of blackness and racism, even when they know the facts of blackness and racism, even when they know the facts of blackness and racism, even when they know the facts of blackness and racism.